Defense and Strategy at the Strobe Talbot Center at Brookings. And I'm just delighted today to be able to speak about the progress of military innovation and great power deterrence in the United States today as regards, in particular, China and Russia abroad, with two of the nation's most distinguished and accomplished and brilliant defense scholars, David Ochmanek and Chris Brose. I'd like to take a minute to introduce each of them and their work, because that's going to set the foundation for where we go with the conversation today. They've both done very important writing over the years, advocating for major changes in how the United States acquires and fields military capability. And while these were always brilliant books on their own terms, and at the time you read them, these were not books that were to be read and forgotten. I hope most of our books at Brookings are not really like that, but and neither one of them wrote for Brookings, to be clear. But these were books that were advocating a change of course and saying this was a matter of some national urgency. So even though I've been privileged to work with both before and host both before, it's been a while since we've taken stock of how the country is doing. And it's now 2 years into the Biden administration, 5 years or so since Secretary of Defense Jim Mattis put out the 2018 National Defense Strategy that essentially formalized the argument the United States should be shifting towards a greater emphasis on deterrence of great power competition and conflict. And therefore, it's an important moment to size up how well we've done. Also, just a few days ago, we hosted Undersecretary of Defense Colin Kahl at Brookings, where he acknowledged and was unapologetic about the fact that the new National Defense Strategy of 2022 for the Biden administration is in many ways building upon the foundation of the 2018 NDS, and in some ways, just the next iteration of the same logic. So it does seem fair to ask, roughly 5 years into this transformation, how are we doing? Before I say a bit of background on both Dave and Chris, let me also apologize that we're only virtual today. That's essentially my fault because I started testing positive for COVID last week. And we've lost Caitlin Talmadge, my colleague and Georgetown professor today, because she's under the weather as well, even for a Zoom appearance. So we're going to have a three-way conversation. Myself, David, and Chris will invite your questions, and some of you have already submitted. We've also got an email address, events@brookings.edu, events@brookings.edu. And for the last 20 minutes or so of our session today, we'll include what's on your mind specifically. And we'll probably finish up at 3 o'clock just because 60 minutes seems to be the optimal Zoom session we found over the years. David Ochmanek, in many ways, is, I think, my big brother and mentor on defense analysis. I've been reading him and learning from him for close to 30 years. His book, The New Calculus, done with a group of scholars at the RAND Corporation in the mid-1990s, began to redefine defense modeling and analysis for the era of precision weaponry and precision strike. It took the lessons of Operation Desert Storm, but a lot of other things that incorporated them and made some big arguments backed up by a lot of serious analysis of how the United States should rethink the challenge of deterring or fighting regional conflict, the likes of the Saddam Husseins, the North Koreas, the Irans. And like with all of Dave's work, the ideas are big, but the analysis is rigorous and detailed and technologically very extremely well informed. He's done stints in and out of government over the years, in various kinds of planning jobs in the Department of Defense, and generally returning to RAND, where he continues to write transformative literature on the question of how do we improve U.S. military capability for the future. Specifically, in the last few years, he has advocated a kind of forward defense posture in the Western Pacific that would not depend as much on fixed, long, vulnerable runways and big, shiny $10 billion aircraft carriers sailing near China's coast for bringing combat capability to any potential scenario. For example, should China attack Taiwan? He has been looking for ways that we could ensure Taiwan's safety and security with military platforms that are more survivable against the realities of China's anti-access area denial, precision strike capability. And I think the amphibious assault scenario where China tries to seize Taiwan has been central to his work. But he's advocated for very specific kinds of platforms, and that's set a nice standard and metric against which we can evaluate some of the Pentagon's progress in recent years. We'll get to that in just a moment. Chris Brose wrote perhaps the most capturing and captivating book of defense analysis of the last decade in the United States, The Kill Chain, an extremely elegant, catchy concept that really brings it all together, how the United States and other countries in this era of precision strike and modern electronics need to be able to find, acquire, identify, attack targets, and then do this not just locally with one single airplane or ship, but through a complex web of command and control systems that themselves together, all working together collaboratively, constitute what he calls a kill chain. And his argument has also been one of some urgency, saying that we're just not ready for this now, either because of reliance on big vulnerable platforms or reliance on command and control systems that are not robust against cyber attack, or depend too much on single big shiny satellites in space that the enemy can track and attack if it wishes. And we have to find better ways. And he also has put forth a set of proposed solutions, or I should say, in many ways, changes in how we do business that would start to address these problems. All this happens in the context of a situation, and I'll finish here, where the Pentagon and directors of national intelligence, Secretary of State Blinken, have been arguing that we could be looking at an accelerated Chinese plan for pressuring or even attacking Taiwan in the years to come, maybe even in the course of this decade. I'm not sure I'm fully subscribed into the argument that Xi Jinping has a date in mind. I'm not sure I'm subscribed to the argument that he really wants to or plans to use force, but we have to worry about this possibility now if we're going to deter it with the greatest effectiveness and further reduce those chances of what could easily become World War III were it to begin. So gentlemen, thank you for listening to my long introductions, but you both deserve the accolades, and I wanted to set the agenda straight. And Dave, maybe I will start with you in the sense that, again, you're sort of the dean of the three of us for how long you've been doing this, although you haven't lost a step in terms of your youthful vigor or your fresh ideas. but how do you see us doing, my friend, compared with whichever benchmark you find most useful for measuring progress and going back in time to those previous national defense strategies, to your earlier work, et cetera?
Thank you, Mike. And let me say that when I was in Santa Monica in 1990 or 91 or so, and we were getting ready to do what became the new calculus, someone sent me a draft of your doctoral dissertation at Princeton, where you were, was it your senior thesis?
Dissertation.
Either way, you were examining what U.S. force structure should be in a world without the Soviet Union, post-Cold War. And I said to my colleagues, why aren't we doing something like this? So you go back quite a ways too, and I've greatly appreciated your work over the years. So I think you said a benchmark. Let me offer for people's consideration that there are really three benchmarks, or three dimensions that we need to look at when we think about the progress DoD is or is not making toward fielding the kind of force and capabilities that are appropriate for this very challenging world that we're in. Yes, we need to buy more and better stuff. And there's a tendency to focus on the POMs, the budgets, to look for evidence that we're buying that stuff. But that in and of itself is not going to be sufficient to move the needle. We have to have a different way to fight. The legacy approach to power projection that worked so well against the junior varsity adversaries of the world, the Iraqs, the Serbias, the Libyas, consistently fails in our wargaming when it's tested against a China or indeed a Russia, at least a pre-2022 Russia. And I'll talk about the reasons for that in a moment. So in addition to changing what we buy, accelerating the purchase of certain things, buying less of old things, more of new things, think about the concept that is being developed to employ those things in peacetime and war. And then thirdly, the other dimension is posture. By posture, I mean where forces are deployed in peacetime and where they intend to fight from in wartime. People who were following the news back in 1990 will remember that it took 5 months to build that Iron Mountain on the Arabian Peninsula before the coalition was ready to kick Iraqi forces out of Kuwait. We may have 5 days to get our warfighting posture together in a future fight with China. So the expeditionary approach to power projection, which was at the heart of our post-Cold War concepts for deterring aggression, is not appropriate for deterring or defeating aggression by by highly capable adversaries who can create this highly contested environment that will make it very difficult for us to deploy forces into the theater and employ forces there once they arrive. So of those three, posture is the most visible. And let me say that I'm not in government anymore, haven't been since 2014. I don't have a tremendous amount of transparency into the program objective memoranda that are the draft budgets that go to the White House for approval before they go to Congress. And so I'm not going to be able to give a detailed report card on how well DoD is doing in terms of moving investments into the kinds of capabilities that we think are needed for the future. But we all can see how posture is changing. And the short answer is not very much. I read in the press that the Navy now plans to have a fifth submarine based routinely out of Guam. It's been 4 for many years now. 5 is a good thing. That in itself is not going to move the needle. I also read that the Air Force is about to start withdrawing its F-15s out of Kadena. The F-15s at Kadena have been an important source of reassurance for the Japanese. They're an important source of military capabilities in our day-to-day operations in the Western Pacific. They are frankly more targets than they are assets once the war starts, because Kadena is going to be under attack by literally hundreds of accurate ballistic and cruise missiles. Other than that, I don't see a lot of movement in terms of the posture of our forces in the theater. So again, as an observation to people who want to track progress or lack thereof toward having a more robust deterrent vis-a-vis China, I would say watch posture. Let me go back to concept. It's one thing to say that the legacy concept for power projection fails. I say that with high confidence. It's another thing to say what that new concept should be. For about 3 years now, the Joint Staff has been embarked on an effort to develop a new joint warfighting concept, JWC. We've had some ability to participate in that. We at RAND have done some analysis for the J7 as they've done their work. We've run some of their war games for them. The document itself is in its 3rd draft. It is classified. I can say in this forum that what I have seen of it thus far is it's a pretty well-informed essay about the demands of fighting in the highly contested environment that can be created by China or Russia. It is not a blueprint for how to fight in the future. The standard for that blueprint goes all the way back to the 1980s when the Air Force and the Army jointly developed air-land battle, which actually told combatant commanders how to employ forces at their disposal to locate, engage, and destroy the enemy. And you know, time permitting, I could talk about exactly how that was done, but it was a blueprint, and that blueprint drove modernization, it drove posture, it drove training and doctrine. I am not aware that we have that today. And without that, force planning, and I'm a force planner, is a little hard, because the force planner's job is to provide the wherewithal to the warfighter to execute his or her operational concept. So the concept precedes the equipping of the force and the posturing of the force. So incomplete on concept, probably a D on posture. And with regard to stuff, hardware, we do see glimmers of I don't want to just say hope, but progress. Secretary Kendall has been intently focused on China as the problem. There's evidence that he has directed the application of resources to several priority areas that he regards as being most important for enhancing our capabilities vis-a-vis China. We can talk about that in the Q&A. Likewise, General Berger in the Marine Corps certainly seems to get it, to understand the demands that the highly contested environment is placing on our future forces. And he's proposed some fairly radical changes to Marine Corps investment priorities and indeed force structure in order to make that happen. You've seen efforts to ramp up procurement of key weapons and munitions like LRASM, the long-range anti-ship missile, like Maritime Strike Tactom, like AARGM-ER, a longer-range missile for suppressing radar-guided surface-to-air missiles. You've seen the Air Force begin to slowly invest in those prosaic things that make air bases harder to kill. Things like fuel bladders, things like just simply the ability to be more agile in moving your force around. You've seen certainly investments in R&D in new concepts for generating combat power without reliance on big platforms and fixed facilities, as Mike said. The LCAT program, the low-cost, you should never do acronyms in public, attritable aircraft technology. The Air Force has flown something called the XQ-58 Valkyrie half a dozen times. It works. It's launched from a boat trailer. It's recovered with a parachute. For the first time since the dawn of air warfare, the Air Force has the prospect of generating combat power without reliance on runways and other fixed facilities. It puts the scud hunting problem on red. With total air superiority over the desert, we couldn't solve the scud hunting problem in Operation Desert Storm. I want to give that problem to China. I don't know how much has been invested in that in the latest draft budget. I hope it's quite a bit. Again, the words coming from Secretary Kendall are fairly encouraging. I know I've been running on for too long. I'm gonna leave it there in confidence that Mike will steer me back to being on topic as we go forward. Thank you.
Dave, that's a great framing. And I just want to turn things now over to Chris with the same basic question of how are we doing by whatever metrics or goalposts you consider the most useful. Let me once again do a nice plug for your book, The Kill Chain, and also say, Chris, I didn't give enough of his biography before. He wrote speeches for both Colin Powell and Condoleezza Rice. He was the staff director for Senator John McCain during the last years of Senator McCain's extraordinarily distinguished life and career, and is now the chairman of Anduril Industries, which seeks to actually solve some of the problems that Chris has been writing about in this book. So we're delighted to have you as well, my friend, and over to you.
Well, thanks, Mike. I appreciate it. And yeah, always appreciate the plug for the book and additional sales. But I think it was an extended series of footnotes and citations of Dave Ochmanek and Mike O'Hanlon. So, thank you both for just the phenomenal work and thinking you've done on this for far longer than I have. You've asked a big question, and I guess the answer I'd offer is we're starting to make progress, but I don't think that it's as much or as fast as it needs to be. So, you kind of bound this around 2018. I'd sort of, pull it back to the left of, more like 2014, I think, when you could start the clock on what I would consider to be sort of like the, kind of the DC Defense Enterprises kind of the collective reawakening to the problem of China. You saw Russia's invasion of Ukraine, annexation of Crimea, things that China started doing that, were very concerning with respect to island building and, kind of increased aggression. So, to some extent, I think that clock started working in 2014. The administration at the time started talking about, kind of the reemergence of great power competition. And then I think, as you correctly said, the NDS, the National Defense Strategy, in 2017, 2018, really started to kind of put this into high relief. So I think like where we are right now on the sort of, kind of the strategic kind of domestic side is positive, right? I mean, you have a series of administrations now from Obama to Trump to Biden that, basically sort of span the political spectrum from one side of the other. And I think for the most part, we've converged around a consensus here in Washington that the pacing threat is China. This is the highest, kind of priority for how to think about military modernization. I think that's good at a time where Democrats and Republicans can't agree that the grass is green and the sky is blue. I think we've focused on and really sort of built an enduring, or it feels like a pretty durable consensus around the most important strategic priority for national defense. That's a good thing. I think similarly, the trend is moving favorably about, kind of us starting to get more serious about this. I think that's, to me, the big question, right? We can go into the details, and I know we will in the Q&A, with respect to the types of things around posture and concepts of operation and different capabilities and puts and takes and where each of the services are. But I think the big fundamental question for the nation comes down to, are we serious or not? Because there have been plenty of times, even in recent history, where we've proclaimed kind of new strategic direction, focus on great power competition, even focus on China. I mean, going all the way back to the early days of the first Bush administration, pre-September 11th, we sort of began embarking on a similar type of venture, only to see it, kind of focused elsewhere. I think the big question for us is, what has not happened in the past is at the level of sort of high strategy and rhetoric being driven down into real nuts and bolts changes to how are we spending money, on what we are spending money, new ways of thinking about employing the force, as Dave mentioned. I think that's where the rubber really meets the road. But it will only meet the road if we're actually serious. So I think in this respect, I know there's some disagreement, over whether the current conflict in Ukraine is a gigantic distraction and waste of U.S. resources vis-a-vis the focus on China, or whether it's something that's very important that we have to be focused on. I'm more of the latter camp, and I would actually say I actually think it's been clarifying for us from a are we serious perspective. I mean, you look at the kinds of things that Undersecretary for Acquisition and Sustainment Bill LaPlante has said recently about, we need to focus on the production of capability. We can talk all we want about new ideas and new technologies and new R&D efforts, or, the idea of producing more in theory. But it only is really going to matter if we are driving real investment into production, into things that we can have at the ready. Because not only did that timeline for us, I think, start earlier, the timeline for China, again, I'm not privy to anything in particular, and we can debate about, whether there even is a timeline or a date out there in the calendar. But what it seems like is over the time where we've debating whether we're serious or not, the date that people are kind of benchmarking against, whether China might do something seems to keep moving to the left. So originally it was out in the 2030s, and now it seems to be kind of creeping deeper into the 2020s. And at some point here, the timeline of whether we're serious about changing and whether they're serious about going, I worry is going to collapse. And we're going to find ourselves kind of ambushed by the future and not ready for it in any contingency. And I think this is the big problem that we have right now is that, and Dave put his finger right on it. The things that we are trying to do take time. Even ramping up production of things that we have takes time, as the war in Ukraine has put into high relief. You want more javelins, you want more Gimlers. Yeah, that's going to take years. To say nothing of the, kind of more exquisite munitions that Dave mentioned, to say nothing of platforms and other things. Even in terms of how the department thinks about, new R&D efforts, those things take longer, right? They're like future efforts that are going to deliver into the 2030s. And I think a lot of the good news story that people seek to tell are things that may deliver, well outside the, time window of when they're really going to be needed. So to me, the real question for us is, how do we increase production of new things that we're going to need and would be able to have inside the next, 2 to 3 to 4 years? And that's not just, 20-year-old things that we've had lying around for a long time. It's also new things that, we could get after, both new capabilities and service of new ConOps. But again, I come back to that question of whether we are serious or not, because I think as a nation, when we are serious, we're capable of doing remarkable things on very rapid timelines. And we've shown that, certainly throughout our history, but even more recently in the case of coronavirus, where as a nation, we decided that we were going to spend an inordinate amount of money trying to develop a vaccine. We've put, very big bets on a handful of potential solutions. Many of them did not pan out. Some of them did. We developed vaccines on a rapid timeline, and notwithstanding your current condition, Michael, I think we're doing pretty well vis-a-vis COVID. That is what America does when it's serious. We make big bets, we consolidate them, we prioritize. not just to sort of have more of the old things that we have, but to develop new things that we desperately need and need quickly. That's going to necessarily entail a level of risk. It's going to require people to incur consequences for doing things differently, for running the risk of potentially failing or waste, fraud, and abuse. But I think this is the only course of action that we have if we want to be truly in a position to, God forbid, be ready for a conflict if one is kind of thrust upon us. But ideally, to have a better and better deterrent posture, now and in the coming years, to keep pushing that timeline farther to the right rather than see it sort of continuing to creep farther to the left. So yeah, really look forward to the conversation, and thanks again for having me.
And likewise, thank you. Let me ask one clarifying question of each of you, and then I want to get into a little bit more on the programmatic and concept and posture side. So also thank you both for framing things in those terms. Clarifying question, are there specific scenarios that concern you most? Dave, I know that the potential Chinese invasion attempt against Taiwan has been one of your preeminent concerns. Is that your number one concern or just among the top five? And the same question really for you, Chris.
Yes, Mike, the Chinese multi-domain invasion of Taiwan, I think, is the appropriate scenario for evaluating our force. Why? Because it is unarguably highly plausible, right? Chinese leaders, one after the other, have publicly stated that they will not rule out the use of military force to compel unification with the mainland. And the way you do that has the highest probability of success from the Chinese standpoint is with an invasion. Coercive strategies that leave the initiative with the adversary can be very open-ended, very uncertain in their effects, and I don't think the Chinese are looking to get into a war that would involve the United States that they can't have some control over the end game for. It's also the most appropriate scenario because it's the most demanding. I think it's more likely that we'll end up fighting China over some issue in the South China Sea, some issue in the East China Sea that involves Japan that we get drawn into, conceivably on the Korean Peninsula. But none of those scenarios has the time pressure of a Taiwan scenario, right? The Chinese could conceivably land 100,000 troops on that island in a matter of 2 weeks. That is a tremendously stressing problem for the combatant commander. And for that reason, it's the problem I want to use to evaluate U.S. forces. If we can prevail in that very stressing scenario, I feel quite confident that we'll have the wherewithal to deal with the less stressing scenarios.
And that's the one, as I go over to Chris, that's the one that you've both written about and alluded to, war games where we lose 17 in a row at the Pentagon, right, over the years. That's, as Chris described in his book, The Kill Chain.
Yes.
Yeah, and I would agree with Dave. I mean, I think that is the most stressing scenario that puts the problem in the highest relief. I think that from a kind of how we think about how we fight and with what we fight, the entire sort of rethinking of the American way of war, I think that is the place where that thinking is really going to have to be done, and I think is starting to be done. I guess like the additional piece that I would add here is I'm again not privy to anything that any special knowledge, and I'm not sure it's clear in the mind of the Chinese leadership that they want to make a go at Taiwan here in the near future. I think the additional concern I have is the kind of steady erosion of America's deterrent capability and what that would mean for alternative ways that China would sort of extend its control over Taiwan, but also other U.S. allies and partners in the region of not seeking to do this primarily through hard power, but through a very coercive strategy that nonetheless kind of brings these countries to heel in a way that makes it very difficult to kind of have the freedom of maneuver and the freedom of strategic flexibility that the U.S. has enjoyed in the region. Allies and partners who want to work with us and are capable of doing so under the pressure they would be facing otherwise.
So I want to do one follow-up question, one big broad follow-up question probably for both of you, and then we start going to the audience pretty soon because a lot of questions are coming in. I think as I listen to you both and of course read you both, I hear you saying that maybe the glass is slightly more than half full in terms of how the U.S. defense innovation and acquisition system is starting to perform, as well as reposturing and deployment of U.S. forces abroad, but not nearly enough. And so you're trying to give sort of a gentle, encouragement to our colleagues who are actually doing this in the military, in industry, and of course, Chris, you are in industry, and Dave, you support these efforts at the Pentagon, but you're trying not to sound in any way, shape, or form complacent, or even of the view that we're definitively headed on the right path. Because just to sort of very quickly recapitulate, I hear you both saying, good to see a lot of R&D being done. Good to see the focus on great power deterrence in doctrine and strategy. You didn't both say this in so many words, but maybe good to see the proliferation of smaller satellites to make our command and control systems more resilient against enemy attack, and the ongoing awareness that we're still vulnerable to cyber attack, although I'm not sure we've done nearly enough to make the systems themselves survivable. You can say more if you wish in a second. We've done well at starting up some interesting R&D programs on things like unmanned underwater vehicles and a pilotless aircraft that could do different new things without runways. And we're buying more munitions of various types that are crucial for a lot of the scenarios that you are focused on, especially the Taiwan scenarios. So all that's on the good side. On the bad side, we actually don't have most of these capabilities in the field today. For example, this X-58 aircraft or other unmanned systems that could be launched by rocket tube and therefore very hard to find if deployed on Okinawa or somewhere else. We're not actually fielding those, as best any of us know in the unclassified literature here and budget documents. Yes, the Navy plans to start building medium and large unmanned surface vessels in the latter part of the decade, but it's not actually building any now. I just reviewed a CBO report that came out this month that says as much. And so any hope, Dave, of putting these permanently stationed unmanned underwater vehicles out in the Western Pacific where they could quickly launch sensors and anti-ship missiles in the event of a Chinese invasion attempt, we can't do that now. And in fact, we don't really have a schedule for when we will be able to do it. So am I accurately summarizing the state of play and the bottom line that each of you sort of sees the glass as maybe slightly half full, but not nearly full enough? And is there any one or two areas of specific programmatic action where you would really want to light a fire under us? By the way, I should have mentioned the Marine Corps as well. Yes, they're doing a lot of interesting things, but they don't really have major new locations from which to do them yet. And I'm not really aware they have longer range surface-to-surface missiles that they can now deploy and didn't have before either. So even though Force Design 2030 is impressive, it sort of again falls into this category of on the one hand, on the other, maybe the glass is slightly half full, but a long ways to go. Have I fairly summarized things, and where do you really want to light a fire under us? Dave, again, starting with you, if I could, please.
Yeah, Mike, I think you've got it exactly right. I wouldn't quibble with anything that you said, and to further the metaphor a little bit, there's a hole in the bottom of the glass. China's not standing still. They're still cranking out hundreds and hundreds of accurate ballistic and cruise missiles every year. They now have the largest Navy in the world. And it's not just hardware. Their training is getting more realistic. They're getting after the kind of issues with their human capital that they are aware of. And so we've got to run pretty hard just to stay even with that. Yes, and while there are promising things that are being experimented with, they are not getting in the hands of the warfighter yet because of this lag time between a decision to produce something and to actually reach IOC and then produce it in numbers. We used to turn out literally thousands of bombers a year in World War II. We are struggling to turn out hundreds of expendable cruise missiles. Now, it's just the nature of the industrial base and the complexity of these systems. Your challenge to identify a couple of priority areas. First, I want to channel Chris for a moment. Chris's basic, and Chris, you're going to correct me if I'm wrong, but this is the way I quote you. You want us to get off of this decades-long vector of producing ever more exquisite, ever more expensive platforms in ever smaller numbers, which is an inherently brittle approach to warfare against a capable adversary, and into the opposite, buying large numbers of inexpensive but very smart things without human beings in them, or with small numbers of human beings manning them, so that we can get back to the principle of mass in warfare. And I would encourage all the services to put a lot of chips on that basic philosophy. Really rapid experimentation with these things. The technologies associated with the platforms are basically 1980s technologies. So we don't have to wait for any magic developments for these things to happen. And if we start experimenting with them in the field, putting some things out there, confronting the Chinese with things they don't expect, I think we'll get not only warfighting value out of that more quickly, but we'll punch above our weight in terms of their deterrent value, simply by getting off the track that China expects us to pursue.
Thank you. And Chris, to you.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I mean, I don't want to come off as more optimistic than I actually am, because I think the real challenge that we have here is sort of a fundamental need to disrupt the way that we have thought about and built and plan to use the United States military now for a generation or more. And I think Dave mentioned some of the points that I think bring it home. Just to focus on shipbuilding, China already has a larger Navy than us. China's shipbuilding industry is about half of global shipbuilding. I think America's, last I saw, is like less than 5%. So not only is China not standing still, the foundation that they have to continue production at scale dwarfs us by an order of magnitude. So we can talk all we want about having a Navy that is 355 or 400 and whatever, or 600 or whatever ships. We're not going to build it. We don't have the capacity to build it. And they have the capacity to just continue to grow the size of that fleet at a way that is just impossible for us to keep up, considering the industrial base that we're starting from. So it's just to say, it's not to talk America down, it's just to be honest about where we are and say, that's not a fight we're going to win. We're not going to win the shipbuilding race. We have to think differently about how we deal with that problem asymmetrically. Again, you look at the geography of Asia, it's not the same as the geography of Europe. Like St. HIMARS is not going to save us here. I think you talk about the production of things that we have. Great, I want to have more of the things that we have. It's going to take us years to do that. And I remember, sitting through briefings when I was back in the Senate Armed Services Committee, asking the Department of Defense why they were, once again, year after year, underinvesting in munitions and weapons lines. And the answer was always, well, we have limited resources. We're going to put those resources into platforms and systems that take longer to procure. And in the event that we get into a pinch, we can turn those weapons lines up real fast. We've been running that social science experiment for 10 years, and it turns out it's not true. It takes years to produce even basic munitions, like javelin weapons and things of that sort, to say nothing of, the higher end things like LRASM. So I think it's more to say, like, if we are going to put ourselves in a position to be competitive, whether you sort of snap the date, at 2025 or 2028 or 2033, we're going to need to do things that create radically different incentives for our industrial base to change and be changed, so that we can produce exactly what Dave mentioned, much larger quantities of lower cost, more expendable, more intelligent systems, things that we will lose in conflict and lose in large numbers. And when lost, we can replenish quickly. This isn't, God forbid, right? A conflict with China, this isn't going to be like, we're going to lose most of what we have, and then, we're going to take over Ford Motor Companies in 3.5 years or so. The arsenal of democracy will ride to the rescue. We have to be completely retooling how we sort of operate and how we have, thought about the industrial base in this country, which again goes back to whether we're serious or not. This isn't just about having more of what we needing more of what we have. It's about new things that we need to be able to get into inventory much faster, get into production much faster. And we're not talking about, a Mars landing here. We're not talking about things that are going to take into the 2030s. We're talking about things that have either been, you mentioned things like, autonomous systems, unmanned systems, different types of weapons, things that we've been playing around with as a country now for 20 years in some cases. The technology is available. It's relatively proven, in some cases, like quite mature. The question again comes back to whether we are serious or not. If we are serious, we can actually catalyze the development and production of these types of technologies on a rapid timeline. It's not going to happen tomorrow, but boy, we don't also have to wait until the early 2030s for it either. So it's fundamentally about the incentives that we create, and I see good things that we can be happy about at the level of rhetoric, at the rhetoric of sort of strategic consensus, and increasingly even about the rhetoric of the need for greater production. But I'm only going to believe it when I actually see programs being started, funding being increased, things that really prove to the government and to industry that we are going in a different direction here, and doing it in a pretty sort of non-reversible way. And we've just not had that level of seriousness to date. And I hope that that's the thing that we'll soon see, kind of turning here.
Great. Let me ask about, there are a couple of audience questions on the industrial base as well, and I want to come back to those in just a second. But let me ask, I think you both rightly emphasize the importance of large numbers of attritable kinds of objects, sensors, payloads, platforms that we can deploy and afford to lose. But are there also some high-end systems that we're just not acquiring enough of or at all? And I think of three examples in particular where I'd be curious for your reaction. One of them is the concept of an unmanned combat aircraft flying off aircraft carriers that could have twice the range of manned aircraft. And the Navy has resisted this concept, even though it's been around a while, but you could theoretically, as I understand the technology, have a 1,500 kilometer unrefueled radius of operations with this kind of a system. And the Navy hasn't really moved in the direction of deploying it. A second would be, now that the INF treaty is gone, should we be building a 1,000 to 3,000 mile surface-to-surface missile? I think there is some R&D happening, but we knew how to build those missiles in the 1980s or before, speaking of that era, Dave, and we could presumably accelerate the transition and give General Berger some of the capabilities on various islands that he doesn't have now, even if he does make his Marines more deployable and expeditionary. And then the last would be the B-21 bomber, which is about to be unveiled publicly in a couple of weeks, I understand. But we have a relatively modest buy, not tiny, but I think 80 to 100 planes. But it's replacing a previous, partly replacing a previous bomber fleet. And you add up all the bombers we've got, and it's not that many. So anything in those categories where you'd like to see us do more, not just in the small stuff, but even in some of the bigger stuff. And Dave,
yeah, I'll jump in. All of those things, Mike, have merit. It's a question of bang for the buck. I was lobbying with others, the Navy, back in 2010, 2011, when I was in the building, to produce a UCAS, an unmanned aircraft for their carrier, which would have longer range and stealth. We got stiffed. Frankly, carriers are never going to generate huge amounts of payload, even in a fairly benign environment. So to the extent we're going to hold on to carriers, yes, it would be better to equip them with a longer range unmanned system for delivering weapons or doing ISR. With regard to surface-to-surface missiles, yes, they're good things. Ballistic missiles are terrific because they do much better against terminal defenses than cruise missiles. And the amphibious invasion force coming across the Strait of Taiwan is going to be in the midst of a hellacious air defense. So a modest number of high-speed missiles, whether they're hypersonic or good old-fashioned ballistic missiles, can help pave the way for the cruise missiles that are going to come in and do most of the killing. A missile that could fly from Guam to the Strait would be a very good thing to have. I am not confident that either the Philippines or Japan is going to be crazy about the idea of long-range surface-to-surface missiles being launched from their territory into China or the environment. In NATO, of course, the distance problem is not nearly as severe. So PRISM, which is the successor to ATACMS, which has about a 500-kilometer range, is just fine for that scenario. And I think the Army should be content to be focusing its investments on weapons and systems for the Korea scenario, for the Russia scenario, and maybe not worry so much about getting massive numbers of long-range missiles for the Pacific. B-21 will be an important part of our force structure for decades to come, but it's not the only way to get long-range aircraft into the fight. The Air Force has experimented successfully with something called palletized munitions, which can turn C-17s into bombers with no modifications required to the avionics in the airplane. Basically, they're just dropping certain kinds of munitions, including LRASM, out the back end of a C-17. So I think the Air Force should move very aggressively to make PRISM, to make pelletized munitions a reality. And yes, continue to move ahead with the B-21 program, recognizing that in future wars, at some point, we're going to run out of standoff weapons. And you're going to want a platform that can get closer to the enemy and deliver more level of effort weapons like JDAM. B-21 is going to be the platform for that in the future.
Super. Chris, any thoughts on that question?
No, I mean, I'd largely agree with the list. I mean, the only one I'd throw on there as well is the undersea force. But, again, we've wanted as a nation, I think, to increase production of, fast attack submarines. That takes an enormous amount of time, right? Even introducing, Virginia payload modules into the systems that we're currently building is a struggle with the state of the industrial base. So I think that's kind of the problem across all of the kind of priorities that we're talking about here. It's like you can make a strategic argument for why you'd want to kind of radically move undersea, why you'd want to kind of prioritize long-range strike like a B-21 over short-range tactical air, why you'd want to have more game in terms of long-range fires for the Army. All of these, under the best of circumstances, are going to take years, and probably in some cases, you're not going to get those things until the 2030s. So the challenge, I think, in the immediate term is, while those good things are hopefully going to deliver later on, what are things that we can do faster now? Different ideas that allow us to come at this problem differently, regardless of how you slice it, right? I mean, shooting a long way, flying a long way, that's going to be an expensive program. That's a long development cycle. That's a hard problem to solve. Are there different ways that we can be innovating, to Dave's earlier point, in terms of concepts of operation, where we can think about coming at this problem differently, where we can start creating, the anti-access area denial bubbles and the red rings of death for the adversary, rather than consistently getting pushed farther and farther away by what the adversary is fielding vis-a-vis us. Again, I think this is an area where I think we'd be wrong to say that concept has to lead technology or technology has to lead concept. I think these things have to be developed iteratively in a way that allow you to make the most rapid progress, but also, I think, really kind of open the eyes both to the technologists on the one side and the operators on the other about what's actually feasible and different ways to go about solving this problem without having to incur an enormous amount of technological risk to do something that is quite difficult, as opposed to something that we could pull together, in 2 to 3 to 4 years that would just create additional problems for the adversary, potentially give them some strategic pause and buy ourselves some more time.
Great. So a few questions from the audience that I'll turn to now. And one of them is really, in many ways, sort of a repackaging of material you've already addressed, but I'd like to hear your answers myself. Are there certain of the military services that you think are doing the best? I won't ask you to be overly critical of anybody unless you wish, but that would sort of be the corollary question. Any service that needs to really get after this set of questions better and with just more of a focus on the urgency of the task. And again, Dave, I can start with you, please.
Okay. I don't have a lot of transparency into the inner workings of all the services. You see every service creating entities to spur innovation, whether it's AFWIC in the Air Force, the Marine Corps Warfighting Lab, Army Futures Command, et cetera, et cetera. And that's all good. At the end of the day, it comes down to execution. I think we're generating. We're beyond step one of the 12-step program of Alcoholics Anonymous. We've admitted we have a problem. We are focusing on that problem. We are generating ideas and concepts for getting after the problem. I have not seen any service actually take the plunge into altering its investment priorities in a dramatic way to get after what look like the most promising ways to actually execute these new concepts. And I'll just leave it at that for now.
Great. Chris?
Yeah, so I think the answer is still to some extent too soon to tell. I mean, I think there are positive things to be called out that deserve credit. I mean, I think what General Berger is trying to do in the Marine Corps deserves all the credit in the world. I think the challenge is, as I think both of you mentioned, is that the ideas make a lot of sense. The concepts make a lot of sense. The drive and energy is there. The question is, how is it being turned into real programs, stood up into new capabilities that can be produced at scale to really follow through on the supervision that the Commandant has? I think the jury's still out on that. I would echo comment Dave made earlier. Again, I think we'll really see kind of the fullness of this effort in the FY24 budget cycle. But I think what Secretary Kendall is seeking to do in the Air Force with his series of operational imperatives is really good. He is trying to use the sort of awesome position that he has as a secretary with Title X authority to remake the service, to reprioritize where the service is spending money, not based on kind of existing programs of record, but actually on integrated mission imperatives that we need to be able to get after. They need to be able to get after as an Air Force, and really again, creating a significant amount of churn and disruption to the program that he inherited and the one that he's seeking to put forward in FY24. Proof will be in the pudding. But again, here you have a senior leader using the authority that person has uniquely in Title X to try to disrupt the way the service does things. I think that's fantastic. I think there's a lot of other cases where the rhetoric is really good, but the follow through remains to be seen. I mean, I think what the Navy's been on a long journey to wrap its head around unmanned systems and embrace the concept. I think they're making strides. They're saying the right things. They're coming to the realization that the only way they're going to have the capacity, the magazine depth that they're going to need is on the back of unmanned systems of all kinds, right? Air, undersea, surface. But this is like first or second semester level economics of how you actually get that into production. You actually build programs around it. You create demand from industry. You make this an enduring priority where you're going to spend a lot of money over a long period of time. Lo and behold, industry will respond. New industry, old industry, big industry, small industry, to try to actually execute and follow through on that vision. So again, for all of this, I think there's good progress that's being made. Some of it's more rhetoric, some of it is increasingly becoming reality. All of it, I think, proofs in the pudding. But it's good that we can actually point to a series of things that we can try to be hopeful about. I think the big question is, we've been saying all along here is, are we making enough progress fast enough? Thus far, I would say the answer to that is still no.
So 2 more questions, and this has been a great session. We have a couple more pieces I want to bring in from excellent questions from the audience. One does get to the industrial base, and there's a couple of questions associated with this general subject. Chris, you wrote in your book about how you'd like to see maybe 5% of the Pentagon budget, maybe $30 billion a year, essentially in a competitive fund that could be awarded to those companies, those concepts that were most promising for building and closing the kill chain. So that's part of the question is, do you think we still need that kind of an incentive acquisition budget that essentially is outside the normal system? There's a second question about the overall role of smaller startups, Silicon Valley, the kind of company that you're involved with now, are we doing enough to bring in new players, new innovative players into the defense acquisition world? And then the third piece of it is, are we redressing vulnerabilities in the supply chain, whether it's because we still depend on overseas parts and components and from parts of the world that aren't so reliable? And one question actually was, are we telling the world too much about all these vulnerabilities, even as we try to push the information out there so people can try to solve the vulnerabilities and build new capacity to replace some of these questionable suppliers that we still have in the supply chain today? So that's a bunch of questions. Don't either one of you please feel obliged to go after all of them, but in the broad subject of how we're doing with the defense acquisition ecosystem, what do you see as the progress? What do you see as still the necessary reform? And on this one, Chris, I'll start with you.
Yeah, I mean, I'll kind of just tie them all together. Look, I think in terms of talking about our vulnerabilities, I'm okay with a level of risk there, because I think the folks that we're worried about the most have a pretty good understanding of what our vulnerabilities are. I'm not sure we're tipping our hand too much in that regard. I'd rather actually, get the benefit of ringing the alarm bell a little bit to drive more focus, kind of internally, domestically, about the need to be better there. I think the broader question, or series of questions, has to do with how are we actually going about modernization? And yeah, my point in the book was that this isn't a problem necessarily about acquisition, right? It is a problem writ large about how we think about requirements, how we build programs and budgets, how we then acquire things, how the Congress authorizes and appropriates. That whole process has become impervious to disruption. And much of what is needed in terms of the disruption to that, I think, is a different way to approach the problem so that we can actually see what the problem is we're trying to solve, as opposed to sort of grasping at pieces of it. So having more of an ability to actually compete out things that we're going to need from a sort of mission outcome standpoint. Are we actually putting investment into the types of capabilities that need to be brought together and integrated to achieve mission effects? The Pentagon doesn't think that way. It doesn't budget that way. Congress doesn't either. So having some kind of a process where we can actually see ourselves accurately, I think, is the first process or the first step of actually beginning to solve this problem. And I think that does involve a greater degree of budget flexibility. I don't necessarily think it has to take the form of what everybody typically assumes that it needs to take, of Congress just gives the department a $20 billion blank check every year and sort of like hopes for the best. They're never going to do that, and they kind of shouldn't. It's more, I think, to say, for a different class of systems, things that are not Virginia-class submarines and B-21s and GBSDs, but the types of sort of larger quantities, lower cost, more expendable, attritable, autonomous systems, weapons, things that we could actually be buying more regularly, things that could be getting better on a more rapid basis. How do we actually set up an alternative process so that we can actually create incentives for disruption, where we can create more competition in industry, where we can actually create incentives to be surprised, rather than constantly always getting what we say that we want, even if it's not necessarily the thing that we need, and actually compete these things out differently. That I still think there's a need for. I don't think that we've yet sort of identified a sort of an enduring process that is impervious to, this senior leader or that senior leader. It tends to always kind of come back to the sort of great man and great woman thesis of change. What individual is doing the best, despite the fact that they can fall down a well tomorrow and never be heard from again. Like, how do we actually create alternative processes to create new capabilities on a rapid timeline and get them to production fast? That's, I think, the answer to the question of, Silicon Valley, non-traditional companies, new entrants. The department writ large and Congress have done a great amount over the past, call it 5 to 10 years, to create more incentives and easier paths for non-traditional players to get in the game and get going. That's good. The problem is that too few of those things are actually getting to large-scale production. So again, to echo Bill LaPlante, it is all about production. But it's not just about the production of things that we've had for 25 or 30 years. It's also about production of new things that we're desperately going to need. Things that can be produced now, things that are ready to be produced now, but things that are not necessarily being produced now because they are not in line with a given program of record, or they may even be a threat to a given program of record. So there's bureaucratic incentives to not move these things to scale. That's, again, where I think senior leaders need to be informing themselves and intervening more to find those kind of important capabilities, kind of trajectory changing capabilities, and using their authority to put resources into them to get them to production. Because unless and until you do that, we're just screwing around with innovation theater. We're not really making an impact at large scale.
Great, Chris. Thank you. Dave, same question for you. And then I've got one final question from the audience specifically for you. And then we'll wrap up. So please.
Yeah, I'm aware of the time. And as a mere political scientist, I have nothing to add to what Chris said. I think he got it just right. Thank you.
Well, thank you as well. But let me now give the final question, which is from my good friend and colleague, Steve Piper, a former U.S. ambassador to Ukraine and now at Stanford, and also spent a lot of his career working on arms control and strategic issues when he wasn't ambassador to Ukraine or otherwise working that part of the world. And he's curious for your further reflections on the state of Russia's military and what we've learned this year. And you alluded at the beginning of our hour-long session to the fact that maybe Russia isn't quite what we thought or quite what they were 12 months ago. But Ambassador Piper would love to hear your further thoughts on that, please.
Yeah. Thanks, Steve, for that excellent question. Steve and I were colleagues together in the Foreign Service way back in the day. I have great respect for him and his work. Yeah, without question, Russia today is not what it was 8 months ago. They've suffered serious losses of personnel, of morale, and of systems on the battlefield of Ukraine, and by all accounts, they're going to continue suffering those losses. That doesn't mean that we should be satisfied indefinitely with the posture and capabilities we have in NATO. I think prudence demands that we assume that at some point Russia is going to stop the flow, stop the bleeding, start rebuilding, and I would just put out there 5 years after the end of hostilities, large-scale hostilities in Ukraine, we ought to be prepared. We ought to hold ourselves to the standard of having an effective force that can defend NATO territory all along the eastern flank. That doesn't need to distract massively from our focus on China. I think a decent U.S. heavy ground force presence in the theater, stationed, not rotationally deployed, new generation of anti-armor weapons, some distributed sensing grid, primarily based on land, because we're defending our own territory. Prosaic things of that nature should be sufficient to convince a rational leader in Moscow not to consider using force against NATO. So the problem just got easier. Our allies are more focused on addressing the problem, at least for the time being, but it hasn't gone away. So we still need to walk and chew gum at the same time, if you will. Well,
Chris Brose, Dave Achmanik, thank you both very much. Very rich conversation. Thanks for the work you continue to do. And, I think, I don't want to summarize. You can correct me if I've got this wrong, but it sounds like you're both giving the overall effort some degree of grading in the general range of a B. But even if that's true, it's not meant to be a gentleman's B. It could be more of a B minus than a B plus. In any event, it's not enough because it's a competition where we got to be aiming for an A. So if that's not an unfair way to summarize some of the arguments, I will thank you both again for joining us. Thank the audience. Wish you both the best and wish everybody a happy Thanksgiving as we sign off from Brookings.
Thank you, Mike. Thanks for the opportunity.